There you go. This should open. Now,
Excellent.
here you can go to the top there where it says slideshow, and we'll make it bigger. And then go over to from the beginning, Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. So can everybody
go with
sorry,
it? Go ahead.
Can everybody see and hear my presentation?
Yeah, your volume's
right.
low, but
my volume's low.
If you speak up, I think it'll be okay.
Okay. Is that better?
Yeah, I think that's better.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, thanks for the nice introduction, Phil. I appreciate it. As Phil mentioned, my name is Price Heiner, and I'm the Forest Archaeologist and Heritage Program Manager for the Rio Grande National Forest, which is basically located in south central Colorado within the San Luis Valley. It basically encompasses much of the upper Rio Grande watershed, as well as the headwaters of the Rio Grande River. And today I'd like to talk with you guys about a research project that we conducted back in the summer of 2017, back when I was on the Carson National Forest in this equivalent position. So that's based out of Taos, New Mexico, back when I was in that position. And note the title of my presentation, Miranda Canyon / Camino Real / Old Spanish Trail Archaeological Research Project. The reason all the slashes is because the trail or the travel corridor that's the subject of my presentation today, I mean, it could be argued that it could be any one of those. It could be an extension of the Camino Real. It might be part of the West Fork of the Old Spanish Trail, or it might be more appropriately called the Miranda Canyon Road, which I'll get into a little bit here. But that is not the focus of my presentation today, is to get into the semantics of what we should call this particular travel corridor, this travel route. The focus of my presentation today is more on just a really excellent example of historic trail archaeology. As I'm sure you guys are all aware, far too often, we have excellent historic documents, journals, diaries, all kinds of things that can help us explain and interpret the past. But often, especially with trail archaeology, we kind of lack the on-the-ground archaeology, the on-the-ground association, or a way to corroborate a lot of these documents and narratives. And I'm sure everyone in the audience, or many of you, have probably had a situation where you're reading historic documents, it's telling you one thing, but then you do the archaeology is telling you something quite different. And there's, of course, another whole bunch of reasons, socio-political, politics, all kinds of reasons why those two don't align. But I think it's just really important to have that on the ground archaeological component when you're doing historic archaeology, especially trail archaeology like this. So the focus of my study, or my presentation today, is on a really outstanding example of just on the ground trail archaeology, historic trail archaeology. And as far as the name of it, again, we could argue the semantics all day about what this particular travel corridor was, or maybe all of those. But I'm going to call it the Miranda Canyon Road today, or the Miranda Valley Road. You'll hear me refer to it as because when the Spanish first arrived at Picaris Pueblo in the early 17th century, they noted this really well-developed road, and it's in most of the chroniclers and priests' journals, heading north from Picaris Pueblo to Taos Pueblo, and it went through the Miranda Valley, which is what they called that. So if you're not familiar with where the Miranda Valley is, it's just north of Picaris Pueblo, around Llano Quemado, if you're familiar with the Taos area. But so this road went right through that valley up to Taos Pueblo, and they referred to it as the Miranda Canyon Road, or the Miranda Valley Road. So that's what I'm going to refer to it today, because it is going right through that particular valley, which I'll get into a little bit more later on in the presentation. So before I get into the actual results of this of our research project here, I just want to get to a little bit of project background. It's going to be the more boring part of the presentation, but I just want to give everyone context a little bit. So the Miranda Canyon acquisition was a 5,000-acre acquisition that was private land that was conveyed to the Carson National Forest in 2015, 2016. And of course, the minute the forests or any land management agencies get a chunk of land, they want to start managing. They want to start building roads and access into it and trails and start to manage it, grazing allotments, prescribed burns, all that kind of stuff. But before they can do any of that, they have to do environmental analysis. And as part of that, they have to do hydrologic analysis, soils, wildlife analysis, and of course, cultural resources, which was my role in this particular project. And by that, I mean, we have to find and document and record any cultural resources that might be significant within these project areas, within the footprints of these project areas, and develop a plan to protect the significant stuff. So the minute they got this acquisition, we kind of knew that this area would be loaded with archaeology. Basically, we had a pretty good idea that this road was running through this acquisition. And it was mostly from local informants, gentlemen like by the name of Porky Hockey, Mark Henderson, Mickey Blake. They were all sort of local historic trail enthusiasts and provided a lot of information about possibly that this road ran through here. Also, the topography of this particular area, and you'll see a map here a little later on, but it's very restrictive. So it's a very steep, rough terrain. If you're going to have a major travel corridor going through this particular acquisition, there's only one or two places that could actually go, especially if you're going to have lots of stock animals and carts and possibly light wagons, that kind of thing. You'd need a big travel corridor. So based on the restrictive topography, as well as these excellent informants that I've actually become friends with most of them as well, we had a pretty darn good idea where this travel corridor is running through. And of course, we wanted to get out there and document it as much as possible, record it, as well as any associated campsites, any kind of archaeology associated with this travel corridor before they were going to do any projects or as part of that environmental analysis. From an archaeological probability standpoint, if you model this entire kind of landscape, the travel corridor that's the subject of this presentation today was also just the highest probability area for any archaeology period within this particular allotment. There's other places that were more minor, but the travel corridor that's going through the Smyrna Valley was the high probability area. So of course we wanted to get out and record it, get ahead of it, document it, and have a plan to protect it. So as far as doing that, we enlisted the services of a archaeological contract firm called Paleocultural Resource Group. And maybe some of you are familiar with this particular organization, but it's run by Dr. Mark Mitchell, who's just really noted Plains and Rocky Mountains archaeologist. I've worked with him many times in the past, and he's also on other trail archaeology projects. But they were responsible for all of the data collection, artifact analysis, and final report write-up in collaboration with the forest. So of course, I worked with Mark for the design, to design the research and kind of what we were going to focus on, but they were responsible for all the data collection and the report that came out of this. So that's kind of the background. So in a nutshell, as far as what we were doing and why we were documenting or where we were looking to document sections of this, what we're calling the Miranda Valley Road. All right, now to get into kind of some of the results and what we were actually looking for. So what we were looking for is what they call swales. And I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with this, but so as opposed to roads, which are prepared. And I guess the best example I can think about, or I can give for a prepared road would be like a Roman road, where they have certain layers of substrate they would put on it for drainage and just to build it. Whereas these are just user created, just from heavy traffic going back and forth, incising into the landscape and creating berms on either side. So and we're referring to those as swales. So that's what we were really looking for, is swales that were in this kind of tight, narrow, V-shaped valley that you can see right here. That's to try to document this historic route, historic trail. And of course, it'd be somewhat difficult in some cases. Some places we could parse out the different, because there was you can see a Forest Service road right in here. There was also 2 tracks from ATVs and just logging and just all kinds of other stuff. So sometimes it was difficult to parse out the palimpsest of different trail segments on top of each other and what was historic, what wasn't. And other times it was really clear to where we were like, wow, this is what we're looking for here. And of course, once we found these kinds of things like this is what we were looking for, more of in a open meadow setting, but we've metal detected alongside of these trail swales as well as in them, and where the valley would kind of open up, where there was a possibility for parajes or other associated camp locations. We metal detected those in grid patterns too, and just found some really amazing stuff, which I'll present a little later here in the presentation. But this is a good example of open meadow trail swale. The trees also helped us date a lot of stuff, because obviously a lot of the trees that are in the trail swales probably weren't there when they were using the trail. So they grew after the fact the trail was abandoned at some point and began to fill in. So a lot of these trees that were growing in the trail swales, we tree cored them for tree ring dating. Many of them dated between about 150 and 400 years ago. So of the period of significance of any of those time periods, as far as the Old Spanish trails, 29 to 48, something like that, Camino Real. So it would actually span a lot of the period of significance for those types of things. So, but this particular, I don't know if we cored this particular tree, but this just shows an example of trees growing in the trail swale that are helping us date these linear features. And of course, associated artifacts were the primary way. Here's another example of a trail swale going through an open meadow that we were looking at, that we were mapping. And again, metal detecting on either sides of it and whatnot, and trying to find associated camps associated with it. Here's the example of a trail swale that we were looking for in a forested setting. So you can see here, it's kind of incising into the slope here. You can kind of see that berm there where it's kind of incising through. One of the other things that we noted a lot of was blazed trees associated with the trail swale segments. So we'd get these big, oftentimes pondos that had blazes on them. You can see the blaze right there, and there's one on this one that was marking this corridor. So some of those were also cored as part of the research project. But I really like this particular slide because it shows the trail swale itself, two blazed trees, and then you can see these pink flags here. They're marking historic artifacts that are associated with it. So you just get this really good association of trail archaeology, just that we can actually date. And so it's pretty neat to me, this particular photo here. A lot of the trees that were blazed, and I'm sure you guys know something about pondos, but there's a neat little trick with pondos, and of course it depends on the context and a lot of other things. But in general, when those pondos start to self-cull, as you notice in sort of mushroom top, where they're sort of taking all the energy and putting it to the top of the tree, which ends up resulting in a lot of the lower branches dying, that takes a while. So I've been told that takes between 150 and 200 years. But again, there's some environmental context that would sway that. You'd have to core them to get the exact dates, but it's a pretty good indicator that you're dealing with a pretty old tree when it gets to that point, a large diameter pondo. Most of the ones that were blazed were actually large trees like that. So another way to date these trail swale segments. Here's another example of one in a forested setting there. And again, I mean, once you start looking at a lot of these, you realize that you can really tell the difference between these and logging roads, which were blazed and usually cut into a slope. Different kinds of roads and trails that go through these particular acquisitions. You can kind of start to parse out what is prepared and what is more of a user created thing like this. It's way too narrow to be a logging road. But yeah, so that's another one we were looking at as far as in a forested setting. Here's some of the blazed trees that we were looking at. These are just examples of them. There was dozens of these that were along the recorded trail swale segments. But yeah, just gives you an idea of kind of what we were looking at. And again, a lot of these were cored, a lot of them dated to the period of significance for the trail, for various trails. There's Dr. Mark Mitchell himself taking a tree core on the project there. All right, now we'll get into So this is, I'm sure you guys are familiar with topography maps. This is a 1 to 24,000 scale topography map. And this is just showing some of the trail segments they recorded, as well as the associated camps. You can see where it's more narrow. I guess first I'll get into you can just see how steep all the terrain is here. I mean, just major, a lot of little finger valleys, really steep terrain. You can see that's the corridor they went through. And when you look at the landscape in the area, it's there's a lot of V-shaped canyons and a lot of restricted access as far as topography is concerned. So like I said, I mean, just looking at this topo map, that would be one of the major ways that you'd be able to traverse this landscape, especially if it was a major corridor, a major thoroughfare. And then the actually red here is the trail segments that were mapped, where it's more linear and skinny. That was actually where trail swales were, and where it expands out a little bit, that's where we found associated cultural material. So often, and in some cases, quite a bit. Like these two things right here, this could be one combined polygon. Is probably one of the major parajes along this route here. At least when we found the segment we reported about 3,000 feet of this. There's still plenty of more to do on this, but just where it expanded out a little bit. So, but yeah, you can infer. I mean, where it isn't mapped, there wasn't trail swale. So we were really going for physical evidence. I mean, you could definitely fill that in, no problem, and infer where the trail route is running. But again, if it didn't have a decent trail swale that we thought was historic, we did not map. It. So this just kind of shows what was done, what was mapped by PCRG. In total, let's see, they surveyed about 200 acres of this corridor, recorded about a dozen sites, and then mapped around 3,200 feet of the Miranda Valley Road, of what we're calling the Miranda Valley Road, or just this ancient travel corridor, which you'll see here. I'll get into more of the artifacts and some of the occupations that are associated with it that just really demonstrate this was a long-term, continually used corridor by lots of groups over thousands of years. All right. So anyways, there's that. Now we'll get into some of the artifacts. So we found all kinds of neat stuff metal detecting. Most of this was buried, of course, wasn't on the surface. Some of it was, but we found a lot of cone tinklers. And I'm sure most of the audience is aware with what kind of an association those have, but often Hickory Apaches would like to decorate their garb, their leggings and their blouses and garb with cone tinklers. Also fur traders, mountain men would mimic Native American clothing, would often have these as well. We find a lot of these associated with the trail. I don't remember exactly how many. I'd have to look at the report, but there was some concentrations of them as well, but they were found throughout metal detecting. Also quite a bit of cut metal that we had found. And again, cut metal we tend to associate it with the Hickory Apaches, but I'm sure a lot of groups were using metal and cutting it into different tools, scrapers, arrow points, those kinds of things. But these looked like, and I recall recovering a barrel strap nearby where some of this cut metal was. So they weren't using kind of, like how we think about them heating up metal and pounding it flat with your American trade goods, that kind of a thing. I think what we were looking at mostly, at least what we recorded, was more barrel straps, that kind of thing. But we were getting a lot of cut metal. And sometimes in concentrations. Just all kinds of garb like this. We had Charlie Hecker. I don't know if maybe some of you guys know him, but he did a lot of the artifact analysis for this particular, all the metal artifacts for this particular project. And he was saying there was some Spanish colonial stuff mixed in there. He pointed this out as a possible buckle or a belt or a cloak fastener, possibly, that would date to that time period. Lots of hobnails. Hobnails were made to make shoes, and they stopped really doing that in the early 1900s. But we found quite a few of these regularly. And of course, just to let you know, this was like a fraction of what we actually found. Of course, most of what we found was modern nails, screws, bolts, washer, just all kinds of modern background stuff. Maybe one out of every 40 or 50 artifacts was actually something like this, like we'd like that would be noteworthy. But again, hobnails. So I think that's pretty cool to me, because it's almost like, that there's evidence people were walking and walking pretty heavily on the trail, because we found quite a few of these. Their shoes were literally falling apart as they were walking on the trail. But I just think that that's pretty neat. And Charlie thought most of these were from the 19th century, so the 1800s. Most of the hobnails. Also found some weaponry, pretty neat stuff. These were both buried fairly deeply, over 2 feet below the ground surface. When we hit it with the metal detector, of course, we stopped getting excited because most of what we were finding was nails and stuff like that. But this particular one, we hit it, dug, spread out the sediment, put the metal detector back in the hole, rang, and it beeped again and dug deeper and we kept thinking we had to have gotten it. We spread out the sediment, but it just kept going deeper and deeper. And these 2 things were recovered pretty close together. Charlie was thinking this could be some kind of officer sword, or possibly, the Fort Bergman was nearby. The dragoons would have used that route as a shortcut to get through places. He didn't say it was 100% sure, but he said that it possibly could be. This particular one as well. These are pretty deteriorated and rusted as well. That it's looking like there's some range of variation within what we call Green River knives. But if you put this blade, the style, in a spectrum of range of variation for Green River knives, it fits in there very comfortably. And again, the fur traders, mountain men, were known to have used this particular route. Of course, Taos was one of those places that they would come to outfit before they headed into the mountains. So, but Charlie, he was pretty excited about that particular item. So he didn't say it was for sure, but that would be pretty neat. It was pretty buried deep, right off the side of the trail where there would have been a campsite. All right, so here's my favorite artifact, because nothing screams Spanish colonial like a Coscojo. And we didn't find many of these. We found a lot of continklers, a lot of cut metal, a lot of that kind of stuff, but we didn't find a lot of Coscojos. But this is the kind of the sweetest artifact we found on the project. And it was actually found in the bottom of a trail swale, about a foot and a half down, lodged against a rock. So you could just imagine, this thing would have fallen off of the horse, fallen into the trail. And the reason it was still on the trail centuries later is that it had gotten lodged partially under a rock that would have been on the surface of that trail. And then, of course, when the trail got abandoned and filled in, it was just still there. And talk about a direct association. Having this in the trail swale was really cool. And you actually see that what these kind of look like on a Spanish colonial horse. They tend to be a lot simpler than this one. So this particular one had 3 pieces. You can see 1, 2, 3. So I'm getting some feedback or background noise. But anyways, yeah, this was a pretty intricate one. I had Charlie look at this one. Basically said that you can kind of see how the 2 holes are drilled. It's missing one of its lines or chains, but they tended to be generally 2 pieces with 1 hole drilled. This was a 3-piecer with 2 holes drilled. You can also see the decorative. I don't know if you can see it, but see where they incite, they kind of etched the edge of this thing. They decorated it. And then this 3rd piece had a lot of decorations like it was a horse tail. And that's what Charlie had interpreted, the kind of the marks and the decorations on this 3rd piece. So just really, really cool. So we do have the Spanish colonial presence. And we can't forget the prehistoric stuff. So of course we were finding, when the Spaniards first arrived at at Piccary's Pueblo, they noted this road. How long had it been being used? They didn't know, but it was there and it was well prepared. Well, we found a lot of black and white pottery, a lot of campsites, prehistoric campsites associated with this. Most of it was Pueblo related. It was basket maker in Pueblo, but we did find some archaic stuff. So this route, just from the prehistoric evidence we found as well, had probably been being used for at least 1,000 years, if not a lot longer, just for folks to traverse this landscape. But yeah, really neat. Sometimes in some of these open meadows, we'd get a palimpsest, so we'd get just everything kind of stacked on top of each other, a palimpsest of historic stuff, early historic stuff, prehistoric stuff. It was really hard to parse out the occupations, that kind of things. But in other places, it looks like we had kind of distinct spatial occupations, which I'll show you in a slide here toward the end, where it looks like folks were sort of using different, when they were looking for a campsite at the end of the day, we're looking for different physical parameters, because we had some where we had pretty clean occupations where the camps weren't really mixing together. We had a Pueblo occupation, possible early historic Apache occupation. We had some Spanish colonial stuff and some more modern junk. But there's a couple places where those are pretty discrete spatial occupations or manifestations along the trail. So I was starting to think about landscape use over long periods of time. People were all using the trail the same way, the same corridor, but they were obviously picking different campsites. Why? What were those reasons? I'm sure throughout time that changed, but you could get into sort of differential landscape use associated with trail camping over long periods of time. I mean, this is one of those projects that you might be able to get at that. But again, prehistoric, lots of prehistoric stuff on top of everything else. All right. So this is my favorite slide, and it's because it shows, really paints a really neat picture of that long-term continuous use of this travel corridor over thousands of years. And I think that helps to support the argument that if the Miranda Valley Road did indeed exist, like the Spanish said it did, then this would have to be it. This corridor that we recorded. If you look at the rest of that Miranda Valley Road, or the rest of the Miranda Valley acquisition, there's just nowhere for a corridor like this to go through. So if it didn't indeed exist, we believe this is it. But anyways, I just wanted to show you and interpret this map here a little bit, because it has all these just kind of discrete occupations associated with it. So like back in here, so I'll just interpret this right here. The red is the site boundary. The green are trail swales recorded. And you kind of see again, I mean, this is really good demonstration that it's not a trail, it's a travel corridor. You just get the spaghetti noodle of different routes and swales and things within the corridor. But yeah, so that really does demonstrate that well. And then all these little circular things are all point plotted artifacts. Most of them are recovered subsurface through metal detecting. You can see these squared type features. They're metal detection areas. Those aren't features. Those aren't room blocks or anything like that. Those are metal detection grid areas that we did alongside the trail. And then these are point plotted items, all the different things. And I guess one of the cool things about this particular site here, this map, is that a lot of this, we found several cone tinklers and cut metal right back in here. This was a couple more of those. It looked like this was more of a dispersion from that. So we had some of that. A lot of this was like modern washers and bolts and just stuff like that that was from probably automobiles. And you can actually see this is a modern Forest Service road right here coming through this dotted line. So that's an existing Forest Service road. This is an existing fence coming through here. Here's another 2-track running on the other side of the creek. And then here's the trail swales we were recording. And I believe, I can't remember which one of these artifacts, it might have been this one here, but we had 2 pretty good Spanish colonial artifacts, that buckle and another one that came out of this location here, which is along the trails, the actual trail swales, that modern material. And then you see here, this was a Pueblo occupation. We found a ton of black and white pottery, a bunch of obsidian, a couple of points, a projectile point, a hearth, and then there was also some groundstone that was there, but it was pretty discreet. I mean, we pretty much mapped the distribution of where we were seeing the lithics. We didn't really see them outside of this. So this was a Pueblo occupation around 1,000 years old. Possibly a early historic Apache occupation back in here. It would have some potential. You can actually see that it's at the confluence of two drainages coming together. There was some really good deposition right here up on this terrace. That would be neat to maybe do a little testing back over there. But anyway, it looked like another discrete occupation. And then we have all the automobile background garbage that you look at the modern Forest Service road, it makes sense. And you kind of look at this, they're not, in a lot of cases, they are just completely all mixed together. But this looks like we actually have some separate spatial occupations associated with this particular corridor. And only Spanish colonial stuff in the trail swales, or near the trail swales themselves, the two items that came out of that. So kind of got Spanish colonial, Pueblo, I mean, just in general, this entire corridor, this site included. We have the Spanish colonial presence. We have a fur trade possibly presence, likely an early historic or proto-historic Apache presence, prehistoric Pueblo presence, even going back to the archaic, as well as just a general late to 1800s through 1900s background stuff. The youngest artifacts I think I remember, were mostly from, modern pop cans, that kind of stuff. So going all the way up to almost modern times. But just being used since, who knows, at least a few thousand years ago, all the way to modern times. And it's pretty well documented in this travel corridor. It just really paints a neat picture of that. As far as future work, so again, that was my last slide. But as far as future work, there's a lot to be done here. Again, we only mapped about 3,200 feet. Recorded about a dozen sites, but we got a really good start on it. But there's a lot more work to be done on it. There's a lot more that could be mapped, a lot more metal detection that could be done. And just as far as historic trail archaeology, throughout my career, I've had the opportunity to work on some of the neatest historic trails, and I've just never seen the physical evidence like you see in these segments in northern New Mexico. I've had a chance to work on the Lewis and Clark Trail in North Dakota. It's some really good spots. The Dedgewood Trail in South Dakota, the Bloody Bozeman that runs from the Black Hills up to the Goldfields in Montana. We found some really neat stuff along that. But I've had the opportunity to work on some pretty neat trails in my career and just never seen anything like the archaeology produced on this particular project here. So just a real gem. But so the future work would be to record as much of this as possible, document it, and of course the associated sites, and see what we find. But that's it. That's my presentation. Any questions?
Okay. Hey, thanks, Price. That was great. Really interesting.
I got a question.
The occupation.
Sorry.
I was gonna say, how many site forms do you need for that?
Oh God! Like I said, I think they documented. Like I said, the report was pretty big, and they documented. I remember about a dozen sites, but they were pretty complex and big. One of them had pit houses, and it looked like it was a pretty big pueblo that was associated with this road. I mean, it was pretty amazing. That looks like a stopover or something like that, like maybe a place to trade or something. But it was a large community settlement that was associated with it, a prehistoric one.
You can go ahead and stop sharing, and then we'll kind of open up the gallery here.
Wait, let's see. New share? No, not new share. How do I stop sharing?
Should be the green. If you toggle up at the top, I think you should be able to stop it.
It says one participant can share at a time.
Or even at the bottom. There you go. Perfect.
I did it. I don't know how.
You did it.
You did it, Phil.
Not me.
Oh man, hold on. I gotta get.
It's magic. Okay. Yeah, there aren't very many people here, so we'll open this up to questions. I think Jeff had a question. Right off.
I have a couple of things. Price, one of them is, are you familiar with Kate Quinn's master's thesis on the survey of Miranda Canyon?
Kate Wynn? No,
Kate Quinn.
I believe Mark brought it up. It was in his references cited.
Okay.
So yes,
yeah,
it's in, so Mark, I think, addressed that, and he did have that report.
good.
Yep.
Okay. So that was my first survey project, by the way.
Oh, really? Miranda
Way back
Canyon?
yonder, yeah. Yeah, she was kind enough to take a complete green kid and let me wander around in the field with her, pretending I knew what I was doing.
Cool.
So the question, the other question I had was up at that last slide. Was that part of that big site that was way up at the Upper Canyon, just north of the Vallecito?
It was, yeah, so this one was, yes, yep, where where you saw that map and that Prahe off to the left.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's that big site right there. It sure
Okay,
is.
so that all that concentration of nuts and bolts and washers and blah blah blah. There was a lumber camp up there in early 1900s. I don't know exactly the time period now. And they lived up there. It was I know about this because it was my great grandfather,
Oh, cool.
Sim Witt, who had a lumber camp up there, and it might have had a mill up there, but I'm not sure. So they all the guys were camped up there. They were of course living up there because it was too far from anywhere else. And so the last time I was up that high in the canyon would have been, 40 something years ago, probably. My dad took my wife and I up there, and you could still see there were stumps around. He took us up to where the camp was, which was right there close to the Vallecito. And there were still stumps that were cut off at just above waist high, because the guys were, sawing
Cutting in the snow.
Pardon me?
Cutting in the snow. Oftentimes we get those highs the snow levels.
That too, but they're also, they're using 2-man hand saws, so they're
sure.
So they're cutting up high and the area was just littered in these stumps that were 3-4 foot tall. So I was wondering if maybe I was thinking that perhaps what you were getting in there was some detritus in that area associated with that camp, that logging camp up there.
There was a logging cable, and a lot of what we were finding, like the nuts and bolts and washers, were big. I mean, we thought they were coming off trucks. I
bet they were coming off of. I bet they were being used as part of that logging camp up there. Sim Witt's logging camp, and that was the last one. He started out up at the head of the 6 Mile Creek over in Moreno Valley, and then they moved to the U.S. Palo Flachado, and then they moved up to the top of the Miranda Canyon and logged up there, and then over to Chama. And the last of the old timers in the family remembers he's gone now, but anyway, when they moved the camp out of Miranda Canyon and over to Chama, and they were lumbering over there and selling the wood to the railroad.
Tie hacking.
They were, and they had he remembered a string of wagons coming down out of Miranda Canyon and off across the valley, just like a whole boatload of wagons carrying equipment from up there, and down Miranda Canyon and off to the south, to cross the Rio and back up the other side going towards Chama. Anyway, so but I bet that's what that was, because that was right where the logging camp was, and they were cutting all up in that area. So
awesome. Yeah, no, thanks for that. And I do believe, I just remember from Mark's report that, he said it was from trucks, Jeeps. There was a piece of logging cable. So I think a lot of the stuff he described and sort of inventoried would fit right into what you're saying as far as it being logging related detritus. Yep. Good term there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there was a question related to game trails. And you mentioned some attributes with the swales and the erosion and all that. where that would make it different from what you were looking at. But maybe you could expand on why, when you think it's not a game trail and when you think it's something else.
Well, we would mostly go for associated things, you know, so looking for lace trees associated with it, artifacts associated with it. If it didn't have that, but it was similar to other swales as far as just depth and width and things like that, that we had recorded that did have associated dates, we'd just go ahead and include them. I don't know if it was, I mean, if they were trying to discern game trails from other things, because I'm sure that many of these trails started as great. I mean, when it comes to linear historic stuff, oftentimes many of these routes were game trails to begin with, and then they became Native American trails, and then they became historic trails, and then they became forest roads, and sometimes even highways or county roads. And I often get asked that question a lot at work of like, why is there so much archaeology associated with our roads? And, you know, just every time we do a road grading project, every time we do this, we're just running into some archaeological issue. I think because they're all one and the same. They've been these same corridors. And of course, animals.
Path of least resistance.
Yeah, I was going to say that animals usually know how to traverse a landscape way better than us. So that's often why we end up following game trails, because they know what they're doing. They know where we're going. So I would say yes, all of the above. You know, we didn't try to parse that out.
Usually ends up at water, right?
Yes, and it's flat, open, water, you know, all the good stuff that we like.
Yeah.
And it's usually the least steep, the easiest to traverse, you know, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I have a question about just the defining the trails. So you have different size trails, of course. You might say, you know, Santa Fe Trail, it could be hundreds of meters on either side. And you say, here's where we're going to survey and here's where we're going to stop. but then, you know, something like this, you might say, what, 10 meters, 20 meters on either side of the trail?
It just really depended on, like, so where it really opened up a lot, we had a big open meadow, we did a lot more gridding and those things. Where it was more restrictive, we kind of stuck closer to the trail. And sometimes, you know, where we didn't think we would get stuff dropped, like often we would want to metal detect after a steep section, and then where it got flat again, we'd want to metal detect in those areas, just because you'd think about, you know, and I know Mark has mentioned this, I don't know if he's on here, but that basically, yeah, after they would, you know, have a bunch of stock animals that would go up something steep, their stuff would come loose. They'd have to stop at the top of these and retighten everything. And that's often when stuff would fall off. So we are trying to think about where would just be these good locations. It wasn't on the steep parts. It wasn't on the, so we didn't metal detect a lot of those.
It's where they might camp and where they might stop and rest. And
yep, at the bottoms of steep sections, tops of steep sections, where it really opened up, just that kind of stuff, just trying to capture the highest probability. And it was pretty arbitrary. Of
but common sense, like what would you do for you, right?
And we were pretty limited on just time and money, like we normally are in the federal government.
Okay, so, Sav, you have a question? Go ahead and.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Price, for that presentation. That was great. It's so cool to see all that material. I had two questions. The first, it might not be relevant, but I was wondering if you all had conversations about this. I'm thinking about the difference between, you know, travel on foot and travel on horseback. You know, June Sensori had been doing some really interesting work trying to, you know, model movement through landscapes in GIS, not based upon human foot traffic, but on horsebound traffic, and to think about the differences in how you would move through a landscape. You know, so partly I was just interested if you all had been thinking about that difference and whether it was relevant at all. And then the other question was, you know, if you had caught any signs or traces of either side trails or locations that would have been destinations in between Taos and Pickeries. I mean, presumably, you know, you're thinking about this as a trail that's going from Pickeries up to Taos, and that makes sense. But there are, you know, all those locations in between that were of interest. And I'm thinking in particular, you know, right near to where you were working, the hot springs, Pot Creek, which was a place of visitation for both peccaries and Taos. And then there's also a big gray chert quarry on the sort of east-facing side of McGaffey Ridge there. Did you, were you finding, segments of the trail that went off towards some of these other locations?
That's a great question. And no, we kind of limited it to this corridor just because of just the time and money and things like that. But we had often talked about, and I know Mark and Mickey and Corky Hawk, and even some of the archaeologists that work on the Carson, like Carrie Levin, would talk about side trails and just things that were out there. But if this particular thing, I mean, that would just be the research potential on this to do exactly what you said, to basically find all the routes, as well as really, like this particular site really gives me hope that we could really look at landscape use associated with trail, changing landscape use over time associated with trail archaeology because of these discrete occupations in some cases. But yes, that was all talked about, but we just didn't have the capacity in this particular case. So we wanted to get that main corridor through the acquisition because the forest was going to start wanting to manage it, start wanting to put in roads and trails and burns and timber sales. And so we weren't really looking outside of that acquisition because of that. But all those connected things, like I know there's Telephone Canyon Road, which is another interesting corridor that might be worth investigating at some point. Yeah, all of that was thought about. We didn't actually talk about the horse versus foot traffic, but all the other like side corridors and everything we did. But that's an interesting thing to bring up with all the hobnails that we found. So it could really start to get into that. And I'm sure someone who's is an expert in those, that could really start to look at and parse out the dates for different hobnails and carpentry and techniques and how they made that, to really get an idea of when those date to and like the use of the trail at different times, because we did find a lot of them. So and yeah, nothing screams walking on the trail more than hobnails. You're more than your shoes falling apart as you're walking. And we didn't find any horseshoes, which is kind of interesting. We did find horseshoe nails, quite a few of those, but yeah, that would be interesting. Like compare the relative amounts of the horseshoe nails versus the hobnails and just sort of get at, were they mostly using horses or were they walking on this thing? Yeah, that very interesting. Thanks. Appreciate it, Severin.
No, that's great work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mark Henderson had a question about if projectile points occurred, kind of in a similar location with historic casings, shell casings, or did you have noticed any kind of association with, some kind of different cultures occurring at the same time?
I didn't notice that. No, not where we had projectile points. I mean, we found maybe 8 to 10 of them on the entire project, different projectile points. And I know 2 or 3 of them were found in that last site that I talked about, that little Pueblo occupation. And I don't think that level of analysis was done by Mark Mitchell. Again, there's so much potential to continue on with this in so many ways. And because everything was point plotted and identified, the data's there to do that. But I can't answer that, Mark. Good question.
And most of the prehistoric indigenous artifacts were on the surface, or did you dig for them?
Yeah, no, we didn't dig for them. They're out on the surface.
Yeah.
Oftentimes they were in erosional areas on hilltops and hill slopes where there was erosion going on and there wasn't a lot of deposition. So there's probably a lot of buried prehistoric stuff because obviously we didn't pick it up with the metal detector. But everything prehistoric was on the surface. Yes. And it was usually in disturbed areas, naturally disturbed, either from erosion or deflation.
Right. And there's a question about the horse bridle artifact you mentioned there, the colonial, and where on the bridle were they located?
Oh, the Coscojo?
Yeah.
So they were located all over. So basically, if you can imagine a Spanish colonial horse with a bridle bit, so they would often put them on the piece that would go over their nose. If there was a leather strap on their chest, they'd be hanging off of that. They would usually be on the margins of their horse blankets, on the margins of their saddles. So you can imagine just like being completely decorated with these things. And from what I understand, there isn't a lot of function to them. Just from they're more of a status symbol. They're more of flair, that kind of thing. And somebody at one point told me they read something about how if you can get they read something somewhere in a Spanish chronicler journal that if you can get 2 or 3 of those riders in full garb with their horses all decked out in the coscojos and run them through a Native American village, it would be so intimidating because of the noise and the glint off of all of it that it would just send them running. They would just so it's probably part intimidation, part flair and status symbol. So like that particular one I showed, I know Charlie had mentioned that was somebody that had a little status, maybe not rich or a noble, but maybe, but definitely had some status to have those kind of coscojos, the kind with 2 strings and 3 pieces to them, and decorated, incised, and just so. But yeah, all over.
Yeah.
Piers, thank you. I'm the one that asked that. How do you spell that word? Coscojo?
Yeah, so hold on, let me write it. I better write it.
Sorry.
So COSCOJOS, or it'd be easier for me to write it down. So
Okay.
COSCOJOS, Coscojo.
Yeah, something to do with eyes, huh? Something to do with eyes, with ojos.
Something.
Yeah.
Actually I don't know. I don't know what it means, what it directly translates to. Does anybody else?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure what it
Okay, well,
exactly translates to.
Thanks a bunch, so thank
Yeah, no problem.
And Mark Henderson was wondering just if you knew about mules or horses and that kind of terrain, would they have been shod, or some explanation why you didn't find horseshoes or mule shoes in there?
That's a good question.
Advantage.
Maybe they were just using them out until they were really worn out. I mean, if you're on the road, I mean, you want to pack as light as possible. Horseshoes are heavy, and having repaired shoes, that's what I would think of. Nails are cheap, horseshoes are heavy. Maybe just use them until they're completely worn out, like beyond where you should. But other than that, I don't know. I couldn't answer that question. But what do you? I see Mark popping up. What do you think, Mark?
You want to add to that question?
Yeah, that was a lead in. Thank you. Thanks, Bryce.
Yeah.
One of the things that I found really interesting about the information on the Old Spanish Trail is that generally the muleteers the mules on the Old Spanish Trail were not shod. And the mule shoeing and metal was really pretty scarce. So there was not a shoeing industry that was compatible. Also, some of the reports indicate that the muleteers felt that didn't want to mess with mule shoes, even if they were available, because it softened up the hooves of the animals. And so when we find mule and horseshoes on the Old Spanish Trail, that in that period of significance before 1848, they're most likely an indicator of use in the American period after 1848. They're also so that also is an indicator that you have sections of trail in Miranda Canyon that, unlike most of the other routes on the Old Spanish Trail, all the various routes to California, that there are very few instances that haven't been overlain with a wagon road. And so that makes the Miranda Canyon and some other trail segments in Taos County, really important, like, and maybe it corresponds exactly with what you said about this being so intact as a trail swale, is these are segments of trail that stopped being used when wagon traffic was available. And these are routes that were too steep to be, portions of them, too steep to be used for wagon traffic.
Yeah, really good point. Yeah, incredibly intact, and that makes a lot of sense. Is that that they would have been abandoned? Yeah, it looks like. I mean, just the stuff that we're finding associated with it still out there is amazing. Like I said, I've had the opportunity, the privilege to work on several historic trail projects in different places, and just never seen. Because like you said, it's often a modern road. It's now a county road. Like most of the Bozeman Trail, it is, some of it's paved, you know, and a lot of it's already a gravel road, but we were finding pretty interesting stuff off of it. But the trail swales themselves are obliterated. This was really intact. So yeah, thanks for that. That's interesting, Mark. I like learning things on these things too.
So do you have any time frame span for when which Spanish group might have been traveling through that area, and just to give everybody an idea about what century you're talking about?
Well, I mean, when the Spaniards first arrived at Picaris Pueblo, what it was is the early 17th century. I want to say 1730 or something, or 1630, where they built the first mission and church there and everything. So, and I'm sure they pretty much headed up that road pretty soon after they arrived and seen it. So I would say beginning the early 17th century, and then continuing on. But obviously the Pueblos, because the Spaniards were wondering how long that had been used, how long it had been in place. This project let us know at least 1,000 years, and probably a lot older. We actually, when we did a little survey for a water development, really early on, we found a large biface that was parallel oblique flake. It was about 10 to 1, its length to thickness. Almost certainly paleo. So we found a Paleo-Indian artifact when we were doing a survey, not on this trail swale, but not on this corridor, somewhere else. It was to the west of this particular canyon, out on the acquisition, and it was just for like a water tank they were going to put in. You know, they were looking to propose cattle, and we found a Paleo-Indian biface. So that 9,000-10,000 years old. So they probably were traveling this route as well. But again, we didn't find any of that direct evidence. Oldest stuff we found here was archaic, you know, right along in this corridor, late archaic, so 2,000 to 3,000. So they've at least been using this corridor for that long. So that, but as far as the Spanish stuff, we're talking early 17th century, beginning at the earliest.
Right. And besides those little scraps of barrel straps, did you find any bigger pieces of barrel strap?
No, we did find one, you know, I think the largest piece was probably 6 inches long. And then all the rest of it was cut up. But that's what led us, because we were having a hard time deciphering because the pieces were so small. I remember Charlie looking at several of them and saying, I think that's a barrel strap, but wasn't sure. And then we found a little later piece of barrel strap about 6 inches long. And then he's like, yep, that's I think that's what all this is. You know, that's what they were cutting. And he was showing me places where the shears had cut and kind of folded the edge, you know, a really clean edge. But yeah, a lot of cut metal there.
Okay, any other questions that we missed, or anyone else I want to add to this? You can unmute yourself and jump in there if you want to.
Phil, I'd like to follow up. This is Mark. I'd like to follow up a little bit on the barrel strap question.
Okay.
Because whiskey was being produced in the Taos Valley, and perhaps the first industrial architecture in New Mexico is Turley Mill, which you know, was sacked and burned in 1847. there was a lot of whiskey being produced in the Taos Valley. And the way of transporting the whiskey was in barrels. And with the method that Susan Boyle mentioned yesterday, you know, with 2 barrels on the side and maybe 1 on the top if it wasn't too heavy. So is it a possibility that those barrel straps are like broken barrels that fell off the mules on the trail? Or do you think they might have been brought in to be processed there? It seems like the barrel straps might be, if they're before 1848, that which most of the trail would be, unless it maybe was associated with the lumber mill activities in the area. If those barrel straps are associated with the trail swales, it would be consistent that they were broken barrels. Although if you lost a barrel, I would guess you wouldn't want to, with the metal as scarce as it is, you'd want to reuse it. So the fact that you found barrel straps that maybe weren't modified, that's interesting to me.
Yeah, I just figured, thank you for that. Yeah, another good point. But yeah, since we found so much cut metal, I just assumed that it was part of that. I can't recall if the bigger chunk that we found actually had, you know, evidence of being cut, or if it was just a piece of a barrel strap. I'd have to go look back in the report. I don't recall exactly, but that's pretty neat. But definitely cut metal, and we were finding it in a couple places in concentration with several cone tinklers as well. So where we had cut metal and cone tinklers together, kind of in the same location. To me, I mean, that is pretty good evidence for an ephemeral sort of hickory Apache occupation. But yeah, that would be neat to be able to date that stuff and find out about the barrel straps. But
So Price, it's
Yeah.
good stuff. So I would ask you to define ephemeral then, because the Picarise was the whole Picarise knob there, as it were, was, you know, Chucky Jam full of Picarias off and on. And so if you're a, you know, mobile hunter-gatherer group, define ephemeral, since you've always got people out on the landscape, you know, moving from one place to another, looking for resources, coming back to main camps, going out and having, you know, short-term camps, all that kind of stuff. Ephemeral might mean something different for, you know, for a Pueblo occupation as opposed to an Apache occupation, which is going to be just the occupation itself is going to be more sort of widespread on the landscape. I think the presence of tinklers in association with cut metal and even you know, the barrel straps fragments is really suspicious to me. That all sounds very Apache to me. There are plenty of instances of you know, where we know they were taking barrel straps and cutting them to make points out of, because barrel, you know, those big thick barrel straps, that's pretty hefty metal. And it's a lot easier to work to do that than some of the other things that have been suggested, like, you know, hoe blades and shovels, and oh my gosh, no, you're not you know.
I can imagine trying to cut those. Oh wow!
Right,
but
and try to cut it with, you know, a hammer and a coal chisel, even, or something like a coal chisel. Trying to you know,
I wouldn't want to try it.
Barrel strap makes perfect sense for all that kind of stuff, and to find that in association with tinklers is just that just cries Apache.
I agree. And as far as ephemeral, I would probably, you know, if I had to define it as far as in a hunter-gatherer context, I'd probably go with the definition of a logistical camp,
Yeah, there you go.
Which is basically, you know, a small, very resource-targeted group that's going out away from the main habitation group to get some particular resource, whether it's hunting, stone, whatever. So it's a very specific task group going out, a hunting party, what have you, and maybe even a war party, and then coming back to the group with that particular resource. So I would imagine there wouldn't be Apache habitation camps along this corridor, I wouldn't think. I think most of the what we're finding associated with Apaches would be considered logistical camp. So that's what I would mean by, and that's Binford defined that.
Yeah, right.
So that's kind of how I would refer to or answer the question you asked about defining ephemeral, would be logistical.
Okay. We're gonna try to more or less stay on schedule here. Is Diane Archuleta present? I hope, our next speaker. Diane Archuleta anywhere? Okay, I was wondering about that. I didn't see her. Hey, Dean, are you ready to go with your talk? Dean Wilson, are you ready to go? He may not be here yet. Okay, well, I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and take a 15-minute break here until 1:30, and we'll see if I can get her on the phone and contact her. If she's not going to present, we'll move on. So let's go ahead, and I'm actually going to, I'll show you a little video about acequias, and we will go ahead, and everybody that has their video on, go ahead and turn their video off, including me.
Mm.
Okay, I hope all of that was visible to you. We all probably needed a bathroom break. And so it is Diane Archuleta, are you here? By chance? How about Dean Wilson? Okay, Dean. How's it going? Are you ready to go?
Are you going to open up your screen?
Hang on a second.
Phil, is there a program? I can't see anything.
No, I gotta make Dean a co-host here and then he can share his screen and then we can get,
Was there a program with Diane? I didn't see one.
no, she is, right now, she's a no-show. So we're gonna skip that and we are going to let Dean Wilson present now.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm here. I just don't see anything. That's all. I see your name.
Okay, hang on. Okay, Dean, I think we can do what you did yesterday. Go ahead and open your screen. And share the screen. You can unmute yourself, Dean.
Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead
Okay.
and share your screen. Go down to the green like we did the other day.
The green arrow?
Yep,
Okay.
and you should be able to share your PowerPoint. Okay, now
Yeah.
go to
Full
slideshow.
screen. My screen is cut off. My
I know.
picture's not
Hang
full
on.
screen.
Go to slideshow at the top, Dean, remember?
Huh?
Click on there. Now slide over to from the beginning. Okay.
Can you see it?
It's a little bit low. I think it's gonna be okay. It depends on the slide. Okay, so sorry for
Okay.
the little glitch.
Can you see my slides changing?
Hang on a second, I'll do your introduction, but sorry for that glitch. But unscheduled cancellation, but that's okay. We'll go through this. Dean Wilson is a research associate and a former director of the OAS Ceramics Analysis Laboratory. And he was, of course, the director. He's still the project manager for the ceramic recording going on at the CNMA, the Center for New Mexico Archaeology. A lot of you all have seen his brown bag lectures from there. and also this project identification he's doing with all these ceramic typologies are unbelievable. And if you haven't gone to the CNMA website and looked at the ceramic studies he's cataloging, it's really unbelievable work and great photography, and something that's been needed to be done for a long time. And Dean's doing it all. So let's welcome Dean Wilson and his talk on the Jemez Black and White, Mountains, Origins and Connections and Revival.
This presentation focuses on the still somewhat poorly known described Pueblo pottery types from north central New Mexico that include Rosa, Gallina, and Jemez Black and White, based on observations and images accumulated during recent examinations of pottery vessels at the Center of New Mexico Archaeology. It appears to me that they reflect a connected tradition of production by Towa-speaking Jemez groups, ancestral to those who still live in the town of the Pueblo of Jemez. And the examination of types in different areas document the movement of people who moved across different and adapted to the farming of different highland and mountain environments across and alongside the Southern Rocky Mountains. In addition, the long period where pottery was not produced by the Jemez, following their movement to the middle Rio Grande, and the relatively recent revival of pottery production is also briefly discussed. When I was starting to put together the various when I went up to the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture to photograph some of the Jemez pottery, I came across one of the front exhibits, which is titled here, A Place of Play by a Jemez potter named Kathleen Walls, as an installation in front of the museum. And I wanted to photograph it and use it because even among a group of people who until recently didn't start making pottery again, obviously the clay and pottery is very important. So so I would like to start off with just reading this list of various things that show the development, important things in the development of pottery manufacturing among Tewa groups in the Jemez area and how they're connected with other groups. If we go 80s, 700 to 1700, this reflects a very long and probably connected sequence of production of distinct organic painted whiteware pottery across highland areas near or within different ranges of the Southern Rocky Mountains. 1250 to 1700 is the production of a very distinct pottery form that I'll describe here as Jemez Black and White by Towa potters residing in very large settlements in the Jemez Highlands. 1598 to 1600, early Spanish colonial period, and this is defined by the establishment of missions at Jemez villages, resulting in a system of control, influence, and oppression. 1681 to 1696 is the Pueblo Revolt and a sequence of Spanish reconquest and village relocations. 1701 to 1703 is the relocation of Towa groups at Jemez or Walla Towa pueblos south of earlier villages in the Jemez Mountains, and the cessation of production of decorated pottery in specific, and the decline of pottery production in general. 1700 to 1848 is the late Spanish colonial and Mexican period. And then 1838, the last groups that take us Pueblo to the west move and are integrated into Jemez Pueblo. And 1848 to now, the United States takes control of the region. Jemez considered sovereign nation within the United States. And 1920 to now, production and sale of simple pottery forms, and then the revival of earlier produced pottery technologies. One second, I'm here. Getting my next slide. Oh, there we go.
Go back, yes.
One of the things when I first started looking at pottery, such as a few pottery type as Rosa black and white, which is produced in the upper San Juan area, the Guyana in the Guyana Highlands, and Jemez black and white. A challenge that I faced is this particular pottery that didn't quite fit with stuff in the other traditions. So that Rosa black and white in the upper San Juan region, it kind of fit the San Juan, but it was distinct in organic paint, and the styles didn't quite coincide with like the mineral painted Piedra produced in other areas. Likewise, the challenge at Guyana is where do we put that? It's usually it was previously included in descriptions of the Northern Rio Grande, but again, just the form and then the associated architecture and everything doesn't really fit with the Rio Grande. And finally, the Jemez and Jemez black and white. It's in the middle Rio Grande, but it doesn't quite fit. It's just and so I talked to Eric Lemon, who's at the same office I am, actually the director of the office, and he said, why don't you have a tentative category where you put the Rosa, the Guyana, and the Jemez black and white, which is all organic paint with kind of bold, isolated styles, and call it the Mountain Anasazi. To which I replied, huh. And so and this like suited me pretty well, because my basic approach to sort of the classification in archaeology is cultural ecology. I see the vast areas occupied in New Mexico and other southwestern states as reflecting the same Pueblo people, just adapting to different environments. So that what I was calling the Rio Grande is basically adaptation to the Rio Grande rift, which is the geological separation of mountains, and then this huge valley in which rivers and alluvial deposits are channeled through. And the Colorado Plateau, which is again a vast plateau with enormous deposits of and mesas filled with shell and sandstone um, um, formations. And we often sometimes call this the Anasazi or the northern Pablo. And then the Magellan Saddle volcanic field, aka the place where the Magellan people are. And it's a big series of mesas and hills. And all these areas both offer different resources for pottery making in terms of the geology and a very different geography and climate in terms of the challenges of adapting to these sorts of areas. So together, I thought perhaps if we could trace the pottery that goes across these highland areas and see if that is connected, then we may have a kind of an understanding of a phenomenon in a group of people and a connection to historic people that we previously really don't have just by the previous sort of spatial or cultural categories that we have used. And so my idea then is during the Pueblo I time period, from about the Animas down through across the upper San Juan region, and then in the various areas that drain into the upper San Juan. That this is characterized by rows of black and white, which also represents one of the first appearances of true villages in the northern Pueblo world. And then, and that mainly is associated with 700 to 900. And then a lot of this area between is still poorly understood, but the area in the Guyana Mountains, about 1050 to 1250, is the Guyana, but the Guyana culture. And another adaptation is still farming and related activities, often in an extremely high environment where we find villages and agricultural sites as well as 8,000 to 9,000 feet. And then down further, the Jemez Mountains and the highlands, which is another manifestation that seems to be reflected by a very long and highland adaptation. And more recently, these folks at 1700 have moved down into the valley. So now they're in a very different environment, but still that seems to connect the modern Towa-speaking Jemez to this long history of people adapting to and making pottery in this vast area that straddles the Rocky Mountains. So, and still we see connections with other areas, is so that the Rose is connected with the northern San Juan and or the Mesa Verde culture by the San Juan drainage. The Guyana has some connections with the northern Rio Grande, since the Chama River flows out from there into the northern Rio Grande, and the Jemez Mountains to the Middle Rio Grande Valley, where Jemez is today, where Jemez flows into. So if these guys are Jemez, all these guys, who are these people? Well, Jemez is historically, like I said, lived in the Jemez Valley, but we know until 1700 they actually lived in the Highland Mountains, and they spoke Toa, which is a Tanoan language, which is extremely different from the Uto-Azteca, the Zuni, or the Keres languages of groups to the south, and is quite different, but not completely different from the Tanoan languages of the Tewa and the Tiwa and other Tanoan speaking groups to the northeast and south. So if we look at the Toa language spoken by modern Jemez, we see that it's connected to the other Toan languages, Tewa, Tiwa, and the various others, but it seems to be separated possibly by 2,000 years. So my challenge then is can we say something about does the pottery reflect a very distinct group of people that may have spoken this separated language through time, and can we distinguish them from other Pueblo groups in other geological and geographic provinces? So one of the theme that I want to discuss here is looking at Rosa Gallina and Jemez pottery is the presence of a long sequence of production of a very distinct and simply organized and executed pottery, particularly compared to much of the pottery produced in large swaths of the Pueblo world that include the Colorado Plateau to the west and the Rio Grande Valley to the east from AD 900 to 1300. Much of the pottery produced in those areas during this time has been recently described in terms of isomeric designs, and this idea and examples of that pottery are presently included in an exhibition presently at the Museum of Indian Arts and Cultures, and I really recommend that you see it. This pottery consists of well-designed, organized, executed, painted patterns with closely spaced designs covering much of the painted vessel surface. This often results in opposing and identical solid or hatchet designs, producing optical reverses with contrasted painted and negative images. And here you can see Mesa Verde black and white produced in the northern San Juan or Mesa Verde region. But this is, again, part of a long sequence of pottery that has the same strategy of sort of negative and complex imagery from at least from 900 to 1300 area across the Colorado Plateau, as well as the early occupations in the northern Rio Grande. So here I will focus on the contrast reflected by the very open and simple and widely spaced geometric designs associated with the sequence of organic painted pottery discussed here, spanning 1,000 years of pottery types assigned to Rosa, Guyena, and famous black and white. So we'll start with Rosa black and white, produced in the upper San Juan, and they're associated with the sort of surface and pit house structures. There's some of the they're often organized into villages, and some of the first villages in the northern part of the Pueblo world. One of the interesting things about Rosa's sites, while they commonly occur sort of in the eastern part of the northern San Juan or Mesa Verde region, they're usually in river drainages in the uppermost or higher portion. So the upper La Plata, the upper Animas, the upper Piedra regions, and often these river valleys is because of most of these rivers are flowing north-south. In the northern part of the village areas, you'll have Rosa sites with this organic painting. And then in the lower or southern part of the villages, you have the later mineral painted types that have this very different strategy of design execution. And so when we look at this pottery, it's Rosa black and white is characterized by designs that are very simple while aesthetically pleasing. The execution may be sloppy. The designs often consist of 2 or 3 unconnected design units or very simple fans that are oriented toward the rim. There's often a circle that they're often oriented around a circle that is located in the bottom, and designs include dots, triangles, circles, and crossed or curved lines. They're mostly represented by bowls, but simply decorated jars are also sometimes reflected, and the paint can actually well, I said the paint is mostly an organic or vegetable paint. It can also, there's a brief experimentation in the use of a really clumpy glaze paint, particularly in the highlands around the Durango area. Now, one of the interesting problems I encountered when I tried to connect the Rosa and the Guyena is Rosa generally dated between 700 to 900, and Guyena 1050 to 1200, which gives us a bit of a gap. But during the Navajo Reservoir project, they also defined the type as bancos, which among other things, seems to be a site again with these very isolated designs, and seems to have been produced in some of the very southern areas of the upper San Juan. And I would propose that it's a type that is intermediate between Rosa and Guyena, and it still needs to be defined and studied much better. But I think it does offer a way in which we can connect these. And then, so then we have the Guyana from about 1050 1050 to 1300. And these are one second, I'm having a little trouble going from side to side here. 1 second, okay. All right, there we go. And so the Guyana structures are really distinct. They're sort of houses within pits rather than pit houses. And the pottery sort of displays some characteristics of later types that you see in the northern San Juan and other areas where you have these more complicated designs. But it tends to be characterized by designs that are often simple and tend to be poorly executed, particularly when compared to contemporaneous ancestral Pueblo types in surrounding areas of the Colorado Plateau and Rio Grande Valley. Motifs may be oriented in simple bands or isolated patterns. Designs often consist of wavering and poorly joined or isolated lines and unaligned elements. The simplicity of the design patterns seems to be reminiscent, and I would say connected, to earlier Rosa black and white, although later characteristics of Pueblo II and Pueblo III types in surrounding areas of the ancestral Pueblo world are represented. Designs are often organized into bowed single motifs that often begin at the rim. Commonly used designs include parallel intersecting lines connected in opposing triangles that often include hourglass or connected triangles, checkered squares, bowed and usually wide space hatched or cross-hatched ribbons. And of course, another characteristic of the pottery is it tends to be kind of sloppy, sort of variably, fired, often so that the designs. But so let's look one more time at a comparison of the Mesa Verde and produced in the Colorado Plateau, the Rosa from the Upper San Juan region during the Pueblo I period, and the Guyana contemporaneous with Mesa Verde. And what we can see is a comparison of a more complex, filled in contrasting images characteristic of pottery from the Colorado plateau that was produced from about 900 to 1200, as reflected by represented here by the two Mesa Verde black and white vessels. As compared to the simple and open systems of decoration previously described and reflected by Rosa black and white, early P1, and Guyana black and white. So, so to me, it just seems like even though these two things are separated by much more time, that they're really connected to each other in a way that some of the other pottery in places like the Colorado Plateau and even the Rio Grande Valley aren't. So, so, so at about 1300, we have we begin to have the populations moving into the Amos highland and a new pottery types produced in the Amos highland. And so the period from 1300 to 1600 is often characterized by populations in the Rio Grande region that include the populations in the Jemez Mountains. And at the same time that's happening, you have biscuit wares in the Rio Grande Valley and the northern Rio Grande and the glaze wares in the middle Rio Grande and surrounding areas. So from 300 years, you have these three distinct pottery groups: the Jemez black and white, the biscuit ware types, and the Rio Grande glaze wares. And they're characterized by different surfaces. So white paste and organic paint for a Jemez black and white, sort of buff the tan, the even brownish surfaces for the biscuit wares, and then the glazed paint, often with the red mineral paint on red and yellow surfaces for the Rio Grande glaze wares. So Jemez black and white is being produced in the northern Rio Grande, and in a way, it is the last of the black and white organic painted potteries produced in the Southwest. And an important question that I want to address now, when we look at a picture of Jemez State Monument that was occupied by several hundred years, it concerns not just the ceramics, but other evidence relating to the potential migration of the Largo Guyana to the Jemez Mountains. When I was still at the Office of Archaeological Studies, I remember Rick Wiseman carefully copying, scaling, orienting, and comparing maps of floor features and layouts from sites in the Guyana and Jemez region, highlands. His conclusion was that a direct connection between the archaeology of the potter of the architecture in the two regions was unavoidable. He noted that the architectural units at sites in both regions share certain key features and layouts that do not appear anywhere else in the public world. I was, and I am still, a believer in this connection, and I also think there's other evidence that I just don't have the time to go into, that there's a similar connection that can be extended to the earlier Rosa phase. So So if we look at the first pottery from the Haemus Highlands, and I went, the first pottery type in the sort of the Haemus sequence, and this is an incredibly rare type. But I want to show this vessel that I recently looked at as part of the CNMA vessel study, because it seems it's located in an area between the Guyana and the Haemus Mountains, and it displays sort of the white paste that you see in Haemus black and the white slip and the dark paste, but the signs that seem to be reminiscent of Guyana black and white, and we see other connections. So this bottom one is a Guyana black and white, and these two, while they're kind of simple and even sort of scruffy with little isolated designs similar to Guyana, are Haemus black and white from big villages in the Haemus Highlands. Haemus black and white, like I said, is one of the last of the true organic painted whitewares produced in the Southwest, except it has if you take off that slip, you get this dark gray paste, but it's covered with this sort of crackled, very well polished slip, and the designs are commonly arranged in simple combinations with widely spaced lines, dotted backgrounds, and short lines with dots just below the rim. Bowls are usually decorated on both of the interior and exterior surface. Designs on jar exteriors and bowl exteriors include very wide open spaces. Again, sort of reminiscent of what we see earlier, but wide spaces between lines and often separated in quadrants. Exterior bowl designs sometimes consist of disconnect panels or geometric figures. Designs include angular or zigzag parallel lines, sometimes with connected triangles. Other common motifs include step triangles, rectangles that may be solid, open, or filled with dots or widely spaced lines. Life forms also occur and include stylized birds and dragonflies. Again, the sparseness and the openness of the design field is often the most distinct and noticeable characteristic of Haemus black and white. And so, and Haemus black and white has this very long periods of production, virtually going unchanged from 1200 to 1700, except when the Spanish come in, it continues. Similar Haemus black and white is produced, but Spanish, but for some, but not all the pottery produced during that time. There's the adoption of Spanish colonial forms. So here's a Haemus black and white with soup plates for the colonial wear, and another one from with a cup dating to that period. Now, so Haemus black and white continues to be produced until about 1700. But as I noted earlier, about 1680 to 1700. There's just this extreme turmoil associated with the Pueblo revolt. And almost all the Pueblos, they go into these defensive areas, and there's a radical change in the pottery that you get all these sort of polychrome forms. You get this in Zia with the transition from glazewares to Punami polychromes. This happens in the northern Rio Grande with the transition of biscuit wares into Tewa polychromes. And the beginning of this happens with the production of Hamis River polychrome, which is one of the rarest types in the Southwest because it's produced for less than a generation, just at a defensive, struggling village or two. And this type is characterized by decorations in organic paint like Hamis black and white, and a red mineral paint, and it's like it's fairly similar to other pottery types that are produced during the Pueblo revolt and reconquest, which include Gouverneur polychrome produced by the Navajo, Punami polychrome produced by the Zia, and Ogapoke polychrome produced by the northern Tewa. And and at this time, there's this transition to these sort of new polychrome types, probably inspired by imagery from the revolt, except Hamis River polychrome is only produced for about 20 years, and suddenly there's a big decline in the production of pottery by Hamis groups as they move up the mountains into the Hamis Valley where they live today. And for the next couple of centuries, most of the well, for almost 2 centuries, most of the pottery at Hamis Pueblo, almost all the decorated pottery, is produced by other pueblos, particularly reflected at this Zia Pueblo. And this trend even begins during the early classic period when glazewares are produced, and at colonial period sites, along with traditional Hamis black and white, colonial forms of Hamis black and white, you find the glazewares produced in the Punami area of Zia, this type called Coyote or glaze F, and it's characterized by a deep dark taste and a basalt temper. And so after 1700, all the pottery produced in the Hamis Valley, which is now where the Towa-speaking Hamis reside, the great majority of the pottery is coming from the Punami area. One of the reasons that's given for this change is that at the end of the revolt, the Amos populations had been really decimated. And so just a few survivors were moved into along the Hamas River in the middle of Rio Grande Valley. As it happened, they went into an area of really high agricultural potential. So that you have this small population now living in a actually really nice river valley where the Hamas still live today. And so they have the choice not to make pottery because they can trade for the pottery made by the Sia, who are making this very nice Punami polychrome pottery, and also have wound up in an area doesn't have the agricultural potential or productivity that the Hamas have in the Hamas Valley. So from 1700 to 1920, just a little bit of utility ware is produced by the Hamas, and almost no decorated wares. It's not until 1920 when pottery becomes a very advantageous thing to produce again with the continuing market that begins with the tourist period. And so they start producing a fairly simple, small little forms that are influenced and inspired by the polychrome, the types that have been long produced at Zia Pueblo. And then pottery becomes also more and more common and an important part of the tourist. And so after the 1930s, when pottery takes place, it's just all over the place. You have poster, ware, greenware, carved pottery, coiled pottery, mold pottery, and it's some of it, and some of it's pretty nice, and some of it's just downright awful. And in the beginning in the 1970s or so, there's a movement to get back to the types of pottery that were produced earlier. One of the first attempts to this is by Evelyn Behill, who was a potter who traced her lineage through Pecos Pueblo. So she's started making some really nice replica glazewares and learning relearning sort of the glazeware tradition out from Pecos. And then even more recently, some potters like Joshua Mandela have from Hamas Pueblo have begun a revival of Hamas pottery. I've met him, especially when he's come to talk to Eric Glenman, who also makes pottery, and together they've really searched, and looked at refining the original sources of paste and temper and paint and slip for the Hamas black and white, and a lot of his pottery is quite nice. It's not perfect replications Hamas, and some of the styles sort of meander more to that the techniques you see in the Colorado Plateau that I discussed. But still, it's very nice, and it really is inspired and connected to the Hamas pottery, so that so the one so in summary, the unique ceramic tradition that began over 1400 years ago along the mountain edges of the Rocky Mountains that include the Upper San Juan, the Guyana, and the Hamas, again is alive and well. That's the end of my talk.
Okay, thanks, Dean. Wow. Turns out there's a lot to know about ceramics, right?
Yeah.
That's I get the point. I'm getting it now. Go ahead and you can stop your share and we'll open the gallery here.
Okay. What do I click on?
Toggle at the top. I think you'll see a stop share.
Okay,
It should, there you go.
that's it. Okay.
I think, yeah, that'll work.
Okay. All right, so
Yeah,
next?
just hang on. Yeah, toggle at the top and I think you can, it'll stop the green button,
okay,
that stop share, or it should say
right there, share.
where it says share screen, you should be able to stop. I think I can do it from here. Hang on. There you go. Perfect. Great. Okay, does anyone have any questions for Dean related to what he talked about?
Phil, and Dean, I have sort of a comment question. I think it's fascinating, Dean, that you finally put together the Guyana question. It really makes sense to me. But I'm wondering, how does that compare with the Taos question, where there's also, on the border of what's seen as the core of the Colorado Plateau and Rio Grande core areas, but there's this tradition in Taos of some people have thought plains-ish, like conical bottom utility wares. Do you see similar kind of regionalization?
One of the things that
long-term tradition.
One of the things I didn't go into when I talked about Rosa and in the Upper San Juan is how complex the Upper San Juan is. So to the south, like I said, the Rosa City, you seem to have this continuation of organic painted pottery that I would assume is Blancos-like pottery, and then in the Guyana. In other areas of the Upper San Juan, sort of a classic example is Chimney Rock. There's very different things happen in it, and that you have this mineral painted tradition. And so there's enough variation going on across the Upper San Juan that there's probably room for more than one origin story.
You think that glazeware is all coming from Cerrillos, that they would have been using in Jemez or Guyana?
It's probably coming from Zia.
From Zia?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
So because the Jemez flows down into the middle Rio Grande, and the Zia glacier. When we started looking at the glacier vessels, the Zia and other stuff in the middle Rio Grande is pretty easy to identify because it has this deep dark red paste and a citric basalt temper. And so almost all the glacier that you see in the Jemez is coming from the Zia or somewhere else in the middle Rio Grande.
Okay, there's a question about most of the ceramics you had photographs of there. Where are they reposited?
The
Right.
center, every vessel is in the Center for New Mexico Archaeology, and if you want to, and it's across the road from the animal shelter and dog park.
And they've moved everything from MEAC or up on
They
the.
are moving everything from me. Well, not everything. They're moving that but they're moving most of the archaeological vessels from MEAC to the Center in New Mexico Archaeology, and we're still looking at the vessels. In fact, next week, we'll get back. I'll start looking again at the vessels. The next batch of vessels that are coming in, and we're sort of doing it region by region. And the next region we're going to do is the members.
Okay. Big project, right? Any other questions for Dean? And I'm not sure, is Dr. Crown here? Is Patty Crown already logged in? We're a little bit ahead of schedule now. So
I don't see her in the list, Phil.
yeah, I don't see her either. Okay, well then, surprise. I have a substitute lecture for you. And we're going off the charts now. So I'm going to present this lecture. And for those of you who don't know me, my name's Phil Alldritt. I am an instructor at the University of New Mexico in Taos. I teach archaeology, anthropology, political science, and Latin American history. So my kind of background, I like to mix a lot of ethnohistory and oral tradition and oral history and archaeology, of course. And I like the idea of trying to show a lot of different connections for all of these different really disciplines. And I also worked for the Office of Archaeological Studies with Jeff and others for 14 years. And I started doing archaeology in Latin America and Belize and Guatemala, working on Maya sites from 1987 to about 1993. I was down there. And I came up here and started doing archaeology on the notorious Blueberry Hill project. And started teaching after that. So after 2009, I've been teaching at UNM Taos. But this lecture is about really, we've talked about trade, we've talked about trails, we've talked about burros, horses, and mules. And this really is kind of background information on the history of horses. So I use this in anthropology. I use this for different things, but turns out, of course, there's a lot of archaeology involved with this as well. So in the beginning, we'll go back to the beginning. This hopefully paddock round is supposed to start at 3:30. So hopefully that's where we'll end up with her. In the beginning, I think this might be blocking you all. Hang on. Was the Eohippus, the horse-like creature, prehistoric in this hemisphere that went extinct somewhere around 9,000 BC during the Eohippus time period. And this is interesting, of course, because after it dies, there's no evolutionary process for the horse in this hemisphere. And we'll get to that. So the size of the Eohippus, the relative of the horse, was pretty small, turns out. But just like the different species of the buffalo and the evolution of the bison and Antiquus, it's really kind of interesting that same thing happened to the horse. And we know that because of the fossils and the bones that we find in archaeological context. We find that there's a whole process for that as well, the evolution of the horse. Let me get this. And it goes from small to big as they evolve through the centuries. And prehistorically, we know there are horses. There are horses in the archaeological record in the terms of figurines. And these horses go back about 30,000 years. They're some of the earliest figurines in Europe related to horses. And the horses we know now that are in Europe, there's two types really, the Przezinski's horse and the bow tie, B-O-T-A-I, bow tie horse, that are related to these early horses. They're the oldest ancestors, and they're still around. We're talking about the steppes of Mongolia and Western, East, Central Asia really, and Eastern Asia. But turns out these horses at the time, of course, when they were first domesticated, talking about 3,500 BC for the horse. So roughly 5,500 years ago, horses are domesticated. But these Mongolians and these early steppe cultures, even more recently, the historic steppe cultures are milking horses. And they are using that milk like anyone would use goat milk or cow's milk anywhere else. And the Przezinski's horse, you might recognize this horse, what it looks like, because early on, these horses were painted on the walls in the caves of Western Europe. And talking about, again, 15,000 years ago. At this time, of course, the horses are not domesticated. They're being hunted like wild animals. So just little things you may not have thought of that of a wild horse as at this time during the Paleolithic time, during Neanderthal and after for the Cro-Magnons and early humans when they come into Europe from Africa, they're hunting these horses. And so later on, the horses are bred and they begin to get bigger and stronger, of course. This is the Arabian horse. And the Arabians, they continue to breed them and they become stronger and faster. And meanwhile, the Przezinski's and the bow tie horse are still existing. And they do today. There's great video on YouTube about the people still raising these horses in Asia. And we know this, there's early archaeology with these horses. This is from China, where many horses were buried with chariots in a traditional Chinese way. This is from around 2500 BC, this image. And then of course, the Egyptians and the Assyrians are gonna use horses for not only transportation, but also for racing and sport and warfare, of course. And then the famous, since it's King Tut's 100-year anniversary of the discovery of the tomb in Egypt, I think it's November 1922, Howard Carter. This is the famous horse chariot found in King Tut's tomb, gold-plated. Not solid gold, but gold plated. And then of course the Romans are going to use horses for chariot races later. But what's kind of important about horses in a way is at the beginning, the Yamnaya group, I would encourage, everyone who likes horses to kind of research this. When they domesticate that horse in 3500 BC, it changes everything. I teach this in my anthropology classes because once people can be transported by horse, everything speeds up. The transport of trade, the transport of language, the aggressive warfare with horses begins. And they journey from Central Asia all the way to Europe with their culture. We're talking about movement and diffusion of culture. Well, this increases because of the Yamnaya and their cultural groups traveling, spreading their culture, their language, and everything they can trade. And again, we're talking about 3500 BC, really early. And so in the New World, how did we get horses? I bet Seven knows. But and Matt, of course. But this is an interesting process, kind of what happens here with this, where the Spanish come to the New World. They come to Mexico. And they start their journey up from Mexico into the Southwest. It starts down here at New Galicia and Compostela around 1540. And this is going to be the first expedition up into 1540, up into the Southwest with horses from this route. And during this route, of course, they're encountering villages and they are encountering people without horses. And these groups are seeing horses really for the first time. This would have been a pretty hostile desert through here during this route. And they would have been trying to gain the confidence and allegiance of these groups as they moved up into the Southwest. And so later on, after the Pueblo Revolt, 1680, the Plains tribes and the indigenous people of the mountainous area, Comanche and others, in this area are going to attain horses after the Pueblo Revolt, when many of the horses are abandoned by the Spanish and left behind. Well, this is going to do the same thing for the Plains Indians that it did for the Yamnaya 5,000 years earlier, where now they could travel faster, they could carry more, they became proficient in battle on horses, and a horse became a very integral part of their culture, of course. And it seems, obvious that that would happen. But all of the different attributes and the way it changed their life was from like day to night. So let's imagine they crossed the Beringia Straits at 18,000 years. Well, from 18,000 BC, let's say, until 1680 AD, they don't have horses and they're walking everywhere they go. It's interesting to think about how they were, living and hunting, of course, using game runs and different hunting strategies. But of course, the horse changes everything. And it enables the Plains tribes, of course, to become more nomadic and to move quickly, to carry bigger teepees along the trails with the bigger horses, and freed up some of the manual labor of people moving from place to place that were already being nomadic on the plains. So the Comanche, it becomes part of their art, and it becomes part of their lifestyle. It becomes part of their economy, and it really becomes part of their hierarchy. Who owns the horses? Who owns the most horses? And it's a great prestige for the leadership to have as many horses as they could actually own. This is a Comanche horse helmet, I would call it, or protection, head protection for the Comanche around 1860. And here's some of the glyphs of the Comanche that Seb Foles and his crew have been recording around Taos, where it shows clearly these people are mounted on horses, and a lot of times they're engaging in narrative battles, different than the petroglyphs we had before, where you couldn't tell exactly what was going on. In some of these glyphs, you can tell how many teepees were in the village. You can tell how many arrows were shot during a battle. You can tell maybe even how many people were in a battle. Again, it's a narrative scene, which lends us to want to know more about how these battles were fought and how they were engaging their enemies in this case. And little tokens they would carry. In the archaeological record, then the historical record, there are tokens of horses with hair, maybe taken from an enemy, that were worn and taken into battle for good luck. Other beaded horses they could wear around their neck, same thing. They're kind of icons of horses for good luck. So horses become a symbol of wealth and status and prosperity and good luck in this case. And so we know more about from historic paintings about village life and things that we can know from archaeology in prehistoric times, but not as well as what we can actually know about their clothing and their regalia and their costuming and how they were using horses in the camps and during warfare. And this is a pipe made out of a horse. So obviously it was animal of ritual wealth, of ritual use, and they understood the history of when they got horses, how that really changed their life. And of course, goes without saying, hunting buffalo on the plains and their ability to successfully complete hunts was increased with these horses. And the indigenous people, as I mentioned, used horses as a source of wealth and trading power between groups and between different cultural groups. And so here's a little comparison. This is similar to what Susan was looking at about what in the early 1800s, a horse was worth. In the early 1800s, on native trade routes, the going rates for horses were one ordinary riding horse was worth 8 buffalo robes. One fine racing horse was worth 10 guns. One fine hunting horse was worth several pack animals, or 1 gun and 100 loads of ammunition, or 3 pounds of tobacco, or 15 eagle feathers, or 10 weasel skins, or 5 teepee poles, or 1 buffalo hide teepee cover, or 1 skin shirt and leggings decorated with human hair and quills. So all on the barter system, of course, and it was that way for forever before contact with the Spanish. And so they developed this barter and trade system that later is going to go into the trading posts. And this exists for many, many years. But they basically set up a system of exchange. So the Comanche, the Apache, the Pawnee, the Cherokee, all of the groups, all of the plain groups now are using horses for hunting and warfare. And George Catlin, who is an artist at this time period, noticed how graceful the indigenous people were on horses and how they would use skill by they were able to hide behind their horse and still shoot an arrow during battles. They were able to very quickly and in an organized way eliminate many buffalo and have quick successful hunts. And this of course is going to increase their population, but also give the indigenous people a way to move up in their society and their prowess and hunting and warfare, but it gave them another way to ascend in their group. So Plains Indians probably came into Taos during the time period in the 1800s and were meeting and exchanging trade with the indigenous people in this area as well. And so it's interesting that there weren't horses here until the Spanish brought them, but that the horses continued to evolve in Europe. So it's kind of goes back to that Pangea idea. We got separated. The horses on this hemisphere really they went extinct along with the, if you don't know about the Younger Dryas, I would investigate that around 9000 BC. What might have caused this mass extinction around then in this hemisphere. But the point being is that the early equus, all in the same family, equine, evolved into the horses that the Paleolithic and the Ice Age people were hunting, the same horses that the Mongolians on the steppe domesticated and learned how to ride. And so it's just an interesting evolution of that whole process of how horses got here in the first place. Okay. Thank you.
What was the rest of Jeff's note?
Let's see. I don't know. Oh, about the Nez Perce, saying horses were always here. That's an interesting position to take, because I don't know if there's a lot of evidence for that, but Okay, that could be an oral history thing. I'm not sure about the archaeological evidence for it. You know, what's interesting about it really is that the Brzezinski's horse and the bow tie horse, they have found horses 300,000 years old. They have tested, this is kind of new, last couple of years, DNA from these horses that are 350,000 years old. Well, those horses do not have common DNA with the modern horse. There are 350 species of modern horse around the world. Those horses are not related to this ancient horse, but the Bowtie's horse and the Brzezinski's horse do have common DNA with that horse that's 350,000 years old. That to me is pretty amazing. And that's really what triggered me, like, man, this is pretty good anthropology. I should know something about this. But and the whole process of horses spreading information, spreading trade, and the speed of it. All of a sudden, people that were walking everywhere, now they're riding horses, and it sped up all spread of all cultures in Asia and Europe for sure. And then, of course, it enabled the Plains tribes to facilitate their activities, moving, following the herds, carrying their gear, moving from place to place. Anyone else? I see Patricia Crown has checked in.
Well, Phil, wasn't there also interbreeding with the American soldiers' horses that got loose? So the Spanish horses and those created a new set of offspring?
Definitely. And there's definitely, 350, as I mentioned, worldwide different breeds of horses now. And not only that, people are like, oh, well, is a zebra a horse? No, it's in the family. It's in the Equus, EQUUS family, as well as the burros and donkeys, but they're not technically horses. There are three kinds of horses. There's ponies, there's light horses, and there's heavy horses that would technically be classified as horses. And within those horses, there's 350 different breeds.
Wow.
Any other questions I might try to answer? This new DNA information is really interesting because it's gonna probably narrow down. We'll be able to narrow down exactly when they were domesticated. Okay, all right. Well, let's go on to Dr. Crown. I saw she's checked in. If everybody's okay, we won't take a break and we'll just go on through it. Hello.
Hello.
How are you doing? Welcome.
Thank you. I got on thinking I'd be hearing about Heimer's pottery, and it was about horses.
Yeah, turns out the totally opposite thing of Heimer's pottery.
You gotta love archaeology.
Yeah, we are diverse, right? That's what, celebrate diversity and all that. That's why we're here.
Can I?
You can go ahead and share your screen. If everybody's ready, we'll go through Dr. Crown. Yeah, go ahead and share and then I'll do introduction here.